Hello, thank you for joining me again. This is Jason Liosatos and this is Outside the Box. I've got a great guest on again, Marcus Papadopoulos. Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos is joining us again this afternoon to talk about Yemen, Saudi, Ukraine and NATO and the web of sort of how it all ties in, which is very, very, very interesting. And Marcus is very good at helping us understand that. Marcus, thanks for joining me on the show. Thanks so much for coming.
Oh, it's good to see you again, Jason, and thank you ever so much for inviting me on your excellent show.
Thanks, Marcus. Well, what makes it excellent is people like you. I've got to say that. That's for sure. Just to open up and say that Marcus is the editor of Politics First magazine. I'd just like everyone to go and have a look at that. It's fantastic. Middle East expert, obviously, and that's why we've got you to talk with us. And I'll just kick us off like usual and have a little rant, Marcus, as I normally do, get some things off my chest. Obviously, thank you for your great work to help people understand the incredible madness that's taking place. I've just written a few notes down. It's like a chessboard, what's going on in the world now, and you'll elaborate on that for us and try and help us understand that. As I mentioned earlier to you, Max, it's like an insane asylum now, what we're seeing, and what worries me is that we're getting used to it. That is the worry for me. And all on top of that, we're voting for it. I'm not. I haven't voted for 53 years. I just can't vote for anybody. I know, and it's a trajectory which is going. It's a trajectory of insanity, and we're getting more and more used to it. I'm very worried. It's like, I think I said this last time. It's just like this Nazi, almost like the Nazi Hitler regime. This thing with Washington. It's unbelievable. And again, I want to remind people to go and see what Wesley Clark said on his great video about it, about what he was saying about the Middle East agenda. As Peter Lavelle said the other day when you were speaking to him, I love that show. It's illegal. It's an act of war, but it doesn't matter because Washington stroke Saudis doing it. They must always find demons. In my opinion, and I'll say it as it is, the real demon is the US and Washington, and obviously backed by Israel. That's the real dangerous demon. What worries me, Marcus, we're midwives of the future. The people in control in the world now are like the midwives of the future of humanity, and so are we. For people who haven't even been born yet, the situation down the line. And I'm very, very concerned about the sanity and the imbalances of these people who are waging war on the Middle East to take over and vilify Iran and everything like that. I'll let you just jump in now, but one thing I want to say is another thing I want to mention before I'm really, really, really worried about it. The $60 billion that America has given Saudi, that for me means America is dropping the bombs, really. Now, are those bombs depleted uranium shells again, like Iraq with the birth defects and that? And I think if people look into it, they will be, because it's cheaper than tungsten. It's heavier than lead, but when it explodes, it turns into uranium oxide and it leaves terrible cancers. And for 4.5 billion years, get it straight, everybody. So anyway, that's my little rant. But there's so much to say. We'll have a great chat, Marcus. Talk about Yemen, Marcus. Tell us what's going on. What's happening?
Well, can I just say, you're absolutely right about how the Americans use depleted uranium shells in Iraq. But it's very important for your viewers to know that they also used it in Serbia when they illegally bombed Serbia in 1999 over Kosovo. And they dropped hundreds, possibly even thousands of depleted uranium shells on Serbia. And inevitably, the cancer rates in Serbia have grown considerably as a result of that. So yes, they certainly did it in Iraq, but let's not forget they did it in Serbia as well. It's a malicious weapon. And have no moral compunction in employing those sort of weapons against other countries demonstrates to me that they are just as malicious as the weapons themselves. But if we move on to Yemen, what does Yemen tell us? It's another demonstration it's another blatant example of how American interests in the world supersede those interests of all other countries in the world, and America will pursue those interests to the detriment of other countries in the world, no matter where they are. Because in Yemen, what we're seeing is a government which has been forced into exile And the Americans have seen the danger, because it's in the interests of America for that government to remain in power. Why? Because that government is fiercely pro-Saudi, fiercely anti-Iranian, and so the Americans, they very much want to see that government remain in power. Now, they've given a blank check, and I will say that very clearly. They've given a blank check to their Islamist ally, Saudi Arabia, to pursue military action against the Houthi rebels. Now, the Houthi rebels, yes, closely associated with Iran. I don't think any serious person is going to deny that. But what's wrong with that? I mean, we've got factions in Yemen which are closely associated, closely aligned with Islamist Saudi Arabia. And we need to remember that Iran is an independent sovereign country, and it is pursuing its own interests, but it doesn't bomb other countries. It doesn't attack other countries. And what Saudi Arabia is doing at the moment is illegal. Now, people can say that under international law, a government which has been forced into exile, if it requests the help of a foreign power, then it's legal. No, it's not legal. There is no law higher than the United Nations Security Council. If military action is going to be taken anywhere in the world, the has to sit first of all, and then has to vote on it. And for it to take place, the military action, the Security Council has to approve of it. That has not happened with Saudi Arabia. So the Americans are acting illegally through Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia wouldn't be taking this action if they didn't get a nod from the Americans. So what we're seeing in Yemen is a flagrant disregard of international law, a flagrant disregard of the United Nations Security Council. And what the Americans are seeking to achieve in Yemen through their Islamist ally, Saudi Arabia, is to basically destroy influence in Yemen. And also, as well, there's another dimension to it. It's estimated that there are vast amounts of oil reserves off the coast of Yemen. Now, of course, as soon as you say oil, they've got this quite malicious, sinister grin on their face. So that's another reason why they want to make sure they don't lose Yemen to the Houthi rebels, who, naturally are sympathetic to Iran. Also, the Houthis have expressed statements which can be seen as being sympathetic to Russia. Now, that's another alarm bell for Washington. Under no circumstances do the Americans and their Saudi allies want Russian influence in Yemen. So Yemen, it's an illegal act, what's going on at the moment. And it's all about America pursuing and maintaining its geostrategic stranglehold over the Middle East. And let's not forget, every day of the week, Saudi Arabia is bombing Yemen. Now, when does the BBC cover this? And look into the human dimension of this military campaign. How many people in Yemen, innocent civilians, men, women, children, elderly people, are dying as a result of Saudi Arabia's actions? Because let's be frank, the Saudi Arabia is an unknown quantity. We don't know what their competence is. So the fact that they are launching wave after wave of air attacks against Yemen, I would say, means probably that there are many, many civilian casualties. If the Americans can bring vast amounts of human casualty, of civilian casualties, given the fact that they are a superpower, then I think you don't need to be a military expert to conclude that Saudi Arabia, which is far from being a military superpower, is not going to be causing vast amounts of deaths through its pain.
Magnificent, Marcus. I'm really glad. I sort of didn't even want you to stop. It's fantastic what you've been saying. It is wonderful, honestly. I really love listening to you talking about it, and you know so much about it, which is great, and it'll help people understand the mess. And exactly, the BBC, who's covering this stuff? Nobody. They're just a corporate mouthpiece. They're gagged. It's unbelievable.
Well, they give it. I mean, they give it. It's one thing giving token coverage. It's another one really giving proper coverage whereby you are investigating exactly what's happening on the ground. And I'm not seeing BBC reporters in hospitals in Yemen. I wonder why. Because America's not the only country in the world that has a close strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia. Britain does as well. And it's not in the British interests for Saudi Arabia to be discredited. I mean, the British government does not want the BBC to be showing maimed children, for example, dead children in the streets, in the fields in Yemen as of Saudi air attacks, because straight away, ordinary Britain would be asking the British government, why on earth are we allied to a country that's carrying out such hideous attacks?
Well said, Marcus. Fantastic. And I've just been scribbling notes here. I mean, it's barely believable. I'm sitting here watching this play out in the Middle East and at my horror, really. But as I said to you at the beginning, Marcus, in one sense, it is the smelling salts which is awakening the global population. It is the horror of it which is making people realise, almost to come around from the amnesia, and it's like smelling salts that, well, hang on a minute, is the world really run by lunatics? If this was Russia doing this, or something even vaguely like it, they'd be incinerated in no time. And the Saudis, and you can elaborate on this, let's give the Saudis a bashing because they deserve it. They're not a democracy. They're kings. They're cutting people's heads off every day. They're absolute misogynists. The people are living in terror of them. They don't dare stand up against them because they know they'll get their heads chopped off. It's absolutely unbelievable. And for them to be doing the dirty, filthy work of America, and I'll say it dead straight, is like me giving you, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, a gun and a knife and a map and saying, do me a favour, can you go and kill those people for me, Marcus? And everyone knows that's happening, but I don't get in trouble. It's barely, it's beyond belief, Marcus. It's just incredible. And like you said, it's the interests. They've got interest. The interest is for the American people, for that guy to stay in power, those people to stay in power. Can you tell people a bit about that? They're back in Saudi. They're in Saudi now, aren't they?
Well, let's look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the epitome of human rights abuses. Saudi Arabia is the epitome of tyranny, and Saudi Arabia is the epitome of religious extremism and religious terrorism. Every Islamist terrorist attack which has taken place in the world, from New York to Washington to London to Madrid to Damascus to Bali, there is a signpost pointing to Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. Remember, how was al-Qaeda born? Al-Qaeda was born during the 1980s. When and how? Well, when the Russians were in Afghanistan during the 1980s, America and a large part of the Muslim world, led by Saudi Arabia, were backing the Mujahideen. Now, the Mujahideen were projected by the American and the British media as harmless, freedom-loving people, when in fact they were the complete opposite. They were Islamic extremists. And Saudi Arabia pumped in hundreds of millions of dollars to the Mujahideen. They sent so much equipment to them in order to fight the Russians. And of course, they dispatched a certain Osama bin Laden. And he was trained by the they were the heart of the operation to support the Mujahideen. And that was an example of what happens with short-term reckless policies, because the Americans, for example, I mean, the Saudis knew who the Mujahideen was, but the Americans never really thought about the sort of people they were supporting in Afghanistan in the 1980s. They did in 2001 when the same sort of people, ideologically speaking, carried out those disgusting terrorist attacks in New York and Washington. So, Saudi Arabia, in effect, they gave birth to al-Qaeda when they were supporting the Mujahideen during the 1980s. And we can see how al-Qaeda developed from the Soviet-Afghan war, because once the Russians left Afghanistan in 1989, a few years later, the civil war in Bosnia erupted. Now, the Americans supported the Bosnian Muslim side, and the Bosnian Muslim side, once again, was supported by Saudi Arabia. And it was the American government of Bill Clinton that facilitated the arrival in Bosnia, a country in Europe, of Mujahideen from Afghanistan. They brought Mujahideen fighters into Europe. I mean, let's be clear about that. The Americans brought Islamic fighters, Islamic extremist fighters into Europe. They facilitated that. And vast amounts of Saudi arms deliveries to the Bosnian Muslims. And a lot of those deliveries were occurring at Tuzla Airport in Bosnia, which was at the time it was, but it was a dirty little secret. So that's a very sort of brief history of how al-Qaeda was born and how it gained in stature. And let's not forget as well, it's widely believed that Osama bin Laden visited Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, in 1994, and he was given a Bosnian passport. He was given Bosnian citizenship by the Bosnian Muslim authorities under the leadership of Alija Izetbegović. And Izetbegović was a known Islamist. He wrote a book called The Islamic Declaration. He was put in prison for that in the 1980s by the Yugoslav authorities. But you see how al-Qaeda was developing into quite a force. And also you see how the Americans will work with Islamists when it suits them. It suited to Afghanistan in the 1980s against the Russians. It certainly suited them to work with Islamic extremists in Bosnia. And then we saw a few years ago how they teamed up again with Islamic extremists in Libya. And now we see how they're working with Islamic extremists in Syria to overthrow the Syrian government. So, Saudi Arabia is a wicked country, by which I mean the country, the government, the system, not the people. They're a bad country in that respect. But who's worse? It's America, because no American support, no Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia wouldn't be doing what it's doing in Yemen, in Yemen, for example, without America. So, who is the one that facilitates an atrocity? The person that pulls the trigger, or the person that provides the gun to the person to carry it out? Well, it's the person that's provided the gun, because no them, no atrocity.
Fabulous, Marcus. Thank you so very much. Bravo. Just writing down here, I wonder what would happen if everyone in the world, or a vast majority of the population, suddenly realised the truth of history and what's going on and the truth of current events. There would be, crikey Moses, there'd be uproar. And I mean, as I was just writing down here, each ethically compromised new person in the White House, the same old face with the same old regime, same old thing, and like you said, the Americans brought the fighters into Europe. It's incredible, and they'll work with, and just to actually, support you with what you're saying there. They'll support anyone and be friends with them and kiss them in tents in the desert, like Libya and like Saddam. It's sickening, and then they'll hang them on television in the next breath, or it's incredible what's going on, the hypocrisy. And my show is literally about morals and empathy, ethics, and I mean, like I heard you say on another program, it's almost the opposite of what they say. When they say something about Russia, it's the opposite, and it's them. I think the inverse, I think was the word you used, I think it was. It's incredible. Yeah. And I think that what's happening, like you said about Saudi, what's happening over there is I respect Saudi more, even though they're a brutal, rapacious, dreadful regime, cruel, terrible dictators, self-appointed dictators or whatever, but at least they're chopping people's heads off on television, and they're not hiding the fact that they're more like the Americans, Washington, hiding the facts that they're the greatest terrorist threat in the whole world. It's very worrying, Mark. Very, very worrying.
Well, I think with Saudi Arabia, they don't worry about concealing, for example, their dreadful treatments of women, their dreadful treatments of non-Muslims in Saudi Arabia, their despicable levels of intolerance towards other religions. For example, the chief Mufti of Riyadh, a few weeks ago, he called for the destruction of all churches on the Arabian. Now the Saudis, they don't try and hide that.
Can you just say that sentence again? It broke up there because it sounded very important.
So a few weeks ago, the Saudi, he called for the destruction of all churches on the Arabian Peninsula.
Is that the Saudi king?
Sorry, no, the chief Mufti,
right,
the most senior imam in Saudi Arabia.
Right, he ordered this destruction, because we didn't quite hear you again, of all the churches where?
On the Arabian Peninsula.
Wow.
He called for the destruction of.
Unbelievable. I mean it's barely believable, Marcus. Go on.
But then they won't try and conceal that because they've got the backing of a superpower. And if you've got the backing of a superpower, and also if you know that that backing is not going anywhere because that superpower needs the country concerned to a very, very great extent, which America does need Saudi Arabia, then Saudi Arabia will do as it pleases in the world, and it won't try to conceal that. But yeah, I mean, for a very senior official in Saudi Arabia to call for the destruction of all churches on the Arabian Peninsula, you would have thought that these so-called Christian leaders in the West, for example, in America, would be in absolute uproar about that. But no, there's no comments made on it in any way whatsoever. So a few weeks ago when the West was celebrating Easter, well, why didn't they make a reference to what someone in Saudi Arabia had said, the chief Mufti had said? Why didn't they make a reference to how the people they're backing in Syria desecrate Syrian churches and Syrian monasteries? So these so-called Christians in the West, they're not Christians whatsoever. They just use it when it suits them, and when it becomes a bit slightly inconvenient for them, they will go quiet on it.
Well said, Marcus, and of course we've seen it before in the I think it was the First and Second World War. They back both sides, They're backing both sides. They're hedging their bets. They'll fund anybody. They'll be. I think I heard someone saying the other day they're fighting. They were paying for the people in Syria. It's unbelievable, Marcus. It's very worrying. And where do you think the riches play out in all this? There's a lot of. I believe there's a lot of water around there, a lot of oil. You said there's gas reserves off the coast, I think, as well.
Yeah.
It's always for that reason. And let's just make it clear to people right here. I'm brave enough to say this. If it wasn't for there being an uproar, I can guarantee you these people in Washington are so unscrupulous, and Saudi maybe, they would drop a bomb on RT, on RT's studios all around the world to shut them up. They'd shut everyone up they could. I wrote about a thing in my book called "Kill 'em Just in Case," and it's the same with Iran. They'll kill people just in case that they become a threat or whatever. So even if you haven't got a gun, they'll kill you just in case. They'll drop drone strikes on people, kill them just in case. Even if there's a party, a wedding party, they don't care as long as they kill everyone in there just in case they're guilty. And it's the same with Iran. Iran's done nothing for years. And of course Iran wants a nuclear weapon. I would, if I was Iran, I'd want one very, very quickly. And it's an audacity for them to talk about Iran as if they're a threat. It's terrible audacity. How do you see that playing out in all this with Iran, Marcus?
The correct word, the audacity of the Americans. to talk about a threat from Iran. I mean, it's ludicrous. It's almost like a serial killer talking about human rights abuses. I mean, it's absolutely preposterous. It is. And when we talk about how, allegedly Iran wants to develop nuclear weapons, well, Israel unofficially has nuclear weapons and apparently has something like 300 to 400 nuclear warheads. So the West has allowed Israel to develop nuclear weapons. Well, it's little wonder that another country in the Middle East, which happens to have a very poor relationship with Israel, if you can call it a relationship, there's no diplomatic relations, i.e. Iran, they would want to have nuclear weapons. I mean, that's human nature, action, reaction. But they of course they're going to demonize Iran because they have to put up in order to justify their policy. So they are saying that Iran wants to dominate the Middle East. Iran wants to develop weapons of mass destruction so it can target them at Europe, etc., etc. Well, they never supply any evidence to corroborate their assertion, like what they're saying at the moment against Russia. If we go back a year and a half ago, that's when the talk started of Russia seeking to not just invade and take over Ukraine, but also to invade and take over Poland and also Finland, because don't forget, Finland used to be a part of the Tsarist Empire, blah, 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 blah. It's scaremongering, it's anti-Russian hysteria. In the case of Iran, it's anti-Iranian hysteria. But the point is this. The American government needs to build up a public case against Iran in order to justify its policy of supporting and assisting Saudi air attacks against the Houthi rebels. And how do they do that? They do it through Western media. And Western media, for years and years and years, has been portraying Iran in the most unflattering of ways when it comes to Iran's foreign policy. So as soon as you say Iran to the average person, let's say in Britain or in America, straight away their response is going to be negative. And that's because of the effect of Western media. But Western media is not going to talk about how or who in the last 20 years has invaded X amount of countries, has bombed X amount of countries, has facilitated the overthrow of legitimate governments across the world. They're not going to talk about that, because if they did that, they would expose their own people. And Western media is very much a part of the official mind in America and also in Britain as well.
Well, thanks for that, Marcus. I've just been scribbling things down. I mean, I spoke to someone the other day, I would call him an intelligent person, and I mentioned Russia with something, and they immediately, their eyes like glazed over, and they said, "Oh God, Putin! Yeah, he's such a threat to humanity." And I gave him a little chat, and I told him a few truths about Ukraine and that, and it was like, like they said, NATO's on Russia's doorstep. I mean, sorry, Putin's on NATO's doorstep. It's like me putting a tent outside your house, Marcus, and saying that you're on my doorstep. It's insanity. But
how would the Americans feel if a Russian-led military alliance took in Canada and Mexico as members? Would they sit back and accept that? No, they wouldn't. Look how they reacted. When the Soviet Union placed ICBMs in Cuba, there was nearly a nuclear war. There was nearly World War III. But it seems that it's acceptable for there to be an American-led military alliance on Russia's borders. Why should Russia tolerate that? Russia has every right to national security, as any other country does in the world. And NATO is no friend of Russia. NATO is a malignant force in the world, and its main focus always has been, and in my opinion always will be, Russia. So Russia has every right
to respond to that threat. After all, we're in the year that marks 70 years since the defeat of Nazism. How many Soviet people died fighting against Nazism? Nearly 30 million. And people in the West, politicians in the West and journalists in the West have the audacity to say that Russia and Russians are warmongers, that they have no problem in war. Well, I don't believe America lost 30 million people in World War II. I don't think Britain lost 30 million people in World War II. What Russia was subjected to is unknown of in the history of mankind. No country, no people suffered so terribly as the Russians did in World War II. So Russia knows very well what war is about, and that's why Russia wants peace and it wants security for itself. And the Americans, it's all very well for them to be creating conflicts in North Africa, in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, because it doesn't border their country. And that shows just how dangerous America is in world affairs.
Well said. I had Stefan Verstappen on the show. He's done a documentary called Defense Against the Psychopath, and it was really quite alarming to see, well, actually, yes, they're psychopaths. They're showing psychopathic tendencies and behaviour, and they're in control of human destiny. It's absolutely terrifying. And like I said before, they're like bullies in the schoolyard who will there's any other kid that's getting bigger. I've seen it, any other kid that's getting bigger and might be a threat later on, they'll squash them, kill them, frighten them, sanction them. They'll do anything it possibly takes to stunt their growth or destabilize them or cause trouble. I mean, it's very easy when you've got the power they've got looking down on the chessboard, and you can move a few pieces around, like it's incredible, and I think it was you that said, or was it you said it's intentional chaos? Did you say that, Marcus, or was it someone else? I think you did.
Well, I mean, I think with the Americans, they don't have a strategy, so to speak, but they do have a long-term objective, and that long-term objective is to maintain, is to defend American global dominance. And they will do that by any means. And if that means creating chaos in a country, as they've done in Syria, done in Libya, and as they're doing in Ukraine now, they will do that, providing they believe in the long term it will be beneficial to America. And that once again, that just shows the depraved lengths that the American government will go to. But if I can just point something else out as well, the American governments have been citing this argument, which I believe is a very, very how it's illegitimate what's going on in Yemen, i.e. Saudi Arabia launching air attacks, because the government, which is in exile now, is calling for outside intervention. Well, that's a dubious argument, but let's just say that it's a legitimate argument. We can apply that principle to Syria. The Syrian government is under threat at the moment. So the Syrian government has every right to call Russia in to carry out airstrikes against the Islamist rebels in the country, be it ISIS, be it al-Nusra, be it the Free Syrian Army. So surely what's good for Yemen is good for Syria. The reality is that the Americans would never tolerate that sort of argument because that goes against their interests. So it demonstrates once again that America is not guided by democracy or rule of law or human rights or the United Nations. It's guided by what's good for Pax Americana. In Yemen, a government is in exile. They've gone to support them. In Ukraine, the Ukrainian government of Viktor Yanukovych, which was democratically elected, was overthrown. What did the Americans do? Did they support Viktor Yanukovych and his government? No, they didn't. They supported the people who overthrew him, and more so, they're the ones that brought about the coup in Ukraine. So yes, it's hypocrisy on the one hand, it's double standards on the one hand as well, but on the other hand,
they know very well what they're doing in the world. And they are all about preserving American clout in the world. And as you said, any country which they're fearful of, they will demonize and they will attempt to subdue. Now, they're certainly demonizing Russia. They can't take military action against Russia, of course, because that would be the end of the earth. But they are trying to subdue Russia by placing that cordon sanitaire around Russia's western borders. And if Ukraine was to join NATO, and let's be frank about it, that's the intentions of the present Ukrainian government, that's very much what Washington wants, then Russia will be isolated on its western borders. And I wouldn't say Russia would have been subdued, but they would have been gravely weakened should that happen.
Well said, Marcus. We're running out of time as usual. It's just great. So much for you to say, and we've only just touched the surface of the nuances, the multifaceted nuances of the Middle East and Yemen particularly. And you just remind me when you're saying things, these things keep... It's like, you know, the American children in school, they stand up, pledge allegiance, their flag, hands on hearts. It's like the superior race. I mean, come on. Israel do the same thing. It's like the superior race. It's very Nazi superiority. It's incredible, and we're getting used to it. Just in closing, I will say that I am optimistic like you. I know you're quite optimistic as well, because we've got to be. And because there is a mass awakening and a mass awareness on the planet of people, thanks to people like RT and yourself. And
yourself as well, doing programs like this. It's on the internet. Your program can be seen across the world, so you're playing a role in it as well, which is wonderful.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you. I'd much prefer to be just not doing it myself. It's like a gruesome task sometimes to be watching this madness play out. People, you know, it's not so lovely sometimes, and to know the truth, but the truth will set us free. And I think people are feeling very uncomfortable, and they feeling something's wrong here. And I say to them, when you look at this information, don't see it as negative, see it as positive, because it makes you realize why you didn't feel quite right all these years, that you knew something was seriously not wrong. So just in closing, Marcus, where do you see us going with the awakening, with people becoming more aware? Any predictions where you think it could go? Can we stop the trajectory of insanity with awareness? Are there other people to put into positions of power simply because mostly people get in positions of power, they ethically compromise to the point that's why they get in? You don't get really good people in those positions generally, do you? So any closing comments on that?
I would say that since the illegal, catastrophic invasion of Iraq, the West has become weakened. They're still, of course, exceptionally strong, but they have become weakened. They have been exposed, and Western media, which is, I would say, the most potent weapon in the West's arsenal, still, I would say, is the dominant player when it comes to media in the world, but it doesn't have the field to itself anymore. So I think that that's a reality that is quite haunting for Washington, and it's quite worrying for Washington. So I think that we're going to see more Ukraines. We are going to see more Yemens. In regard to the former Soviet Union, I would say look out for Georgia. I would say look out for Moldova. So it is very sad that there's going to be more countries undermined. There's going to be more human misery, more civilian casualties. But there's no going back to, in quotation marks, the good old days of the 1990s for the Americans, when they were able to do what they wanted in the world because Russia was on its knees. That period will never happen. Yes, America remains a superpower, and it will keep on flexing its muscles, but it can't get away with what it got away with in the 1990s. And the reason why the Americans didn't attack Syria, I would say, is due to the Russian factor. The reason why they're not going to go into Ukraine, though we've got to be careful with them because they are starting to dispatch soldiers there, but nonetheless they're not going to take military action in Ukraine, is
is because of Russia. So yes, we've still got the malignant nature of American foreign policy operating in the world, but on the optimism, we've got a strong Russia, and the evidence of a strong Russia is that a year on from the Western sanctions on the Russian economy is withstanding them, and the Russian ruble is the best performing currency of 2015 so far. So that just shows why Russia isn't going anywhere, because the West sanctions were all about decimating the Russian economy to bring Russia onto its knees. That's not going to happen, and of course that's quite a harsh reality for Washington.
You took the words out of my mouth. I was just going to say that before we close, that it's like a Frankenstein's monster that's dominated the world, which is now flailing. The ruble's getting stronger, the EU and the IMF, the dollar's going down the chute, and it knows that it's in big trouble. So create as much chaos as you can, and one last try to take over everywhere. This is insanity. This is insanity. But that's another whole show, talking about the insanity of them, because it's unbelievable. But Marcus, thanks very much for coming on the show. It's politicsfirst.org. Go there, everybody, and have a look at that, .org.uk. Thanks for joining me again, for your great wisdom on the subject. It's wonderful to speak to someone with such a broad view on the whole subject, and you really do know the chessboard, and we all must learn the chessboard. It's a tedious, gruesome task, but I'm telling everybody now, learn the chessboard, because until you know, like Gurdjieff said, if you want to escape from prison, the first thing you must realize is what kind of prison you're in. So we've got to study the politics, and the stuff first. So thanks, Marcus, for coming on the show. Really appreciate being with you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jason.
Thank you, Marcus. And thanks for everyone for joining me. I'll just splash me up again there. I've had a bit of a coughing fit this show. I hope everyone heard me. And thanks everyone for joining me with Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Join me again another time, and keep learning and seeing what we're doing, because that's the only way forward. Thank you. Bye-bye.